Lucy. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Great. Okay. So hi, everybody. As Lucy said, I'm a director, one of 5 directors actually at Onion Collective. We're a place-based social enterprise based in Watchet in Somerset, which is a tiny little town on the West Somerset coast. And all of our work is community-led, and it has included a range of projects over 10 years, most substantially East Quay, which will open this summer, and is quite a major cultural and enterprise development on the quayside here in Watchet. Includes a gallery and a paper mill and print studios and maker studios, but really is all about community and gathering and connection. And West Somerset, where we're based, is this really beautiful place, but like much of the kind of more peripheral southwest, this sort of apparent idyll hides really some crushing problems. And for us, the most significant of those is a challenge around social mobility. So we have the lowest social mobility in the whole of the UK, meaning that disadvantaged kids growing up here have the least chance of changing their future of those living anywhere else. Given the audience, I guess, by way of illustration, about 26% of our young people go to university, compared to a national figure around 50%. So we work quite closely with our local schools as a consequence. So as I said, we're social entrepreneurs rather than social researchers or social advocates, and that means we seek to take direct action and to transform the existing system. Of course, we also use and gather evidence in our work every day, both to ensure that we're doing good work and paying attention to change and to make sure that we're on track, but also to meet the needs of funders in particular. And our methods, I guess, over the last decade have been built around what is probably quite a familiar to many theory of change and sort of logic framework process, starting with the change that we wish to make and bring about in the world, and measuring and monitoring then outputs and outcomes and the impact over time, but also mindful of the kind of assumptions that underpin that and the risks that might disrupt some of that work. And we engage extensively and repeatedly, using quite traditional methods like public meetings and resident surveys and so on, alongside lots of relational activities, community meals, some arts-based practice in schools, and through COVID, developing our own kind of social capital computer game, which we're now taking to market nationally, and which sort of responds to the fact that we learn and we communicate and we engage better when it's good fun. And then our own monitoring data is, in effect, quantitative and qualitative, and that's then integrated with the data of other bodies and grounded in academic literature. And I think most importantly, what that's enabled is for us to measure change over time, in things like community pride and collective and personal agency. And this last one, personal agency, remaining stubbornly low, despite really high levels of collective empowerment where we are. And I think we hypothesize that this kind of metric reflects there's this sense of disillusionment and disempowerment and lack of control that's really deeply embedded in the social and economic and democratic structures that prevail and that sort of determine the rules of the game, no matter what we seek to affect at a grassroots level. So that kind of structural lens over time has informed an evolution in Onion's work, initially from quite a traditional regeneration approach to one that's more holistic and place-based, and in particular with the addition of a kind of cultural justice perspective onto the more common triple bottom line pillars of economic, social and environmental concern. And that's for us because culture is this kind of missing pillar, and it's the one that speaks most to the things that matter in communities and which sort of underpin our common experience and our common humanity, I guess, if you like. So communities are really about 2 things. They're about relationships. We talk about it as attachment, and they're about culture. And I don't mean by that high art, but I mean the kind of acts of repeated ritual and gathering and creativity and fun and all those things that build community and bond us to one another in place and over time, either backwards or forwards into future generations. So I guess I don't have very long, and but for those interested, I've explored our approach in an article which has recently been published on Medium, and I'll put a link in the chat, which is entitled Attachment Economics and is a precursor to a book that we're hoping to publish in the next year. And this work really reflects the everyday economy literature. but draws further on the kind of diverse or communities economy literature of Gibbs and Graham and others who followed. And that's about some of the things people have talked about earlier. It's about broadening our understanding of what economics is, recognizing that it's emotional and personal and interrelated with how we respond to much else. So obviously how we respond to politics and climate, but also belonging and identity and division and fear and hopelessness and all of these things. And it also highlights that economic narratives, and by extension, the evidence that underpins any of that, needs to be inclusive, needs to have really wide arms, needs to fold in many more people than it has done, needs to be reframed as being about all of us and not just about some of us. And that means paying more attention to the everyday economy, but also widening even further who and what any conception includes. And for us, most importantly, I think it's vital that we hear and record more voices and respond to what they have to say and how they act, so that we can kind of widen this sense of agency for people to be part of a different story, and not just a different narrative, but a really different experience of new possibilities and quite substantial change. So this is all kind of reflected in a second evolution of our work over time, and that's kind of expanded place-based insights towards more movement building and more transformational systems change. And I think we conceive ourselves now as existing within what Donna Haraway calls the boundary period. That's kind of pointing, quoting her, towards this kind of new epoch in which social and economic and environmental justice and systems are being really wholly reconceived, and in which the needs of people and the planet living together are really central. This kind of world in which kin and relationships and connections and respect and living well matter more than profit, where we find that kind of community relations and human interactions are the things that define us. And so for us, our work is about showing what's possible and helping us to change, both as these kind of pioneers of the next economy in action already, if you like, and as practitioners of imagination in practice. So that kind of focus needs a different consideration around the evidence that is needed to support and champion and grow that movement. And I think at Onion, we are quite taken by the community paradigm work that's been articulated particularly well in recent months by New Local, formerly NLGN, a New Local Government Network. And I'll put a link into the chat about that as well. But in it, Jessica Studder from New Local writes, and again quoting, "What is meaningful to people is often qualitative, relationships or well-being, for example. Yet what is required to inform a policy case for change is largely quantitative, focused on measurable service outputs. And this disconnect between value and metrics is systematically overlooked." And I think New Local argue quite convincingly that this evidence paradox really holds back the potential of community power. It's sort of trapped in an impossible situation where it's required to prove its worth using measures that are not set up to recognise its value, unquote. So the old state market paradigm is guided by these metrics, and they're often kind of linear and siloed rather than adaptive and pluralist. I think even with, I'm going to go over a little bit, but you have to bear with me. I think even with qualitative approaches, much of the attention remains a little bit too firmly focused on measuring the things that are easier. So we need to find ways to capture really complex processes and connections that will deliver a radical shift to a new way of being and break us free of these existing preconditions and replace them with something new. And I think for us, in terms of gaps in understanding, the most central preconditions for change, especially around power and agency, which is the thing we're all seeking, are around imagination and attachment and what makes these things possible. But measuring those is really complex and quite unexplored and often really reductive. And it might even be the case that measuring them damages them. So there are some quite serious and complex questions about how we do that. And just to give a quick example, so we work with an organisation called Moral Imaginings, led by a brilliant individual called Phoebe Tickell, whose her practice uses kind of quite meditative and imaginative techniques to help people, often those people most betrayed by the current system, help them reconceive and reimagine a future. And it's a process that is really powerful and like even life-changing for some of the people involved. It's really deep work, and it's emotional more than it's logical, and it nurtures agency and hope and human connection, and it helps people change to how they think about what's possible. And when people are involved in this kind of process and they're asked to imagine the future, they don't ask for things, they ask for like a totally different way of being and express desire for really simple, straightforward things, but that are really human. And this means that the research questions for moral imagination work are about how a practice that can be really easily dismissed as peripheral or fluffy or spiritual is in fact addressing really fundamental policy and human questions about health and well-being, about conflict and difference, about democracy and agency, and how these kinds of practices create the conditions for much better decision making and for a new kind of sense of hope about what's possible. And it sort of is literally the stuff that new futures are made of. And so for us, we've got to this point where this is the kind of evidence that we need to find better ways to explore. And there's this really substantial shift into kind of deep thinking and deep long-term community work. And that I think we need to be moving towards in terms of the evidence questions. So that's our approach, and I look forward to talking about it with you.